Okay, welcome everyone to today's webinar, which focuses on communications and advocacy to promote implementation of the 2030 Agenda. I am Peter Sereni, Communications and Knowledge Management Specialist at the UN Development Operations Coordination Office, which is the Secretariat of the UNDG. I'm really happy to see so many people online. We have about 32 attendees at this moment, and I expect more to trickle in during the course of the webinar. Let me just offer a few introductory words before we get into the substance of our conversation today. So, as you know, people need to know what the SDGs are and what they can do to make this global agenda happen. Effective communications and advocacy to get the word out and inspire people to action are critical for achieving the SDGs. Earlier this year, the UNDG launched 2 new critical pieces of communications and advocacy guidance. One is Fulfilling the Promise, a practical guide for UN advocacy to promote implementation of the 2030 Agenda. And the second piece is the companion piece to the UNDAF guidance on communications and advocacy. These 2 pieces of guidance are part of the UN system's response to the new agenda. The first piece of guidance on joint advocacy for the SDGs is really about sort of how we build constituencies for change to move the agenda forward. And the second piece, the communications piece, the companion piece on communications and advocacy is about how to go about communications not as an add-on, but as an integral part of the UN planning framework at country level, which is namely the UN Development Assistance Framework, or the UNDAF. So these 2 pieces of guidance are really the main content which we are launching now. And this is really the main thrust of the webinar series, which we have launched. So we have 2 key, basically, webinars to watch. The first one is, let me just get my screen going, yeah. The first part is today's webinar, which focuses on the Joint SDGs Advocacy Guide, or the Guide to Joint Advocacy for the SDGs. And we are also, this is one of 3 webinars which are basically very similar in content, but one will be in Spanish. And then we have another set of 3 webinars which are devoting to the UNDAF companion piece on communications and advocacy, happening on October 12th and 16th. The second webinar in this series, so there will be 2 on the 12th and 1 on the 16th, and 1 will be in Spanish. More information on this was provided in the invitation to this webinar today. Just to remind you, before we get into the meat of our discussion, there are 2 basic elements of joint communications at the country level. There is the UN Communications Group, and then the other part is the Joint Communications Strategy. And I see that we have many agency colleagues online, and that's really great. This slide is to show that we are all sharing leadership on joint communications at the country level. It shows which agencies are leading UN communication groups and how many groups they are leading worldwide. So the message is that we're all really playing a key role in joint communications at the country level. Today, I am really fortunate, we are all really fortunate to have with us two guests. The first guest is Jim Schultz. Jim is the founder and executive director of the Democracy Center. He has worked as an advocate and campaigner for more than 40 years and has trained UN staff at the country, regional, and headquarters level. He is the principal author of the Joint Advocacy Guidance, which we are presenting today. The second guest, whom we're really pleased and fortunate to have with us, is Marco Luigi Corsi. He is the UNICEF representative in Mozambique, and he has been leading the way with the UN country team in Mozambique to make major strides in developing an SDGs advocacy strategy and plan. First, today, Jim will give a presentation on the key elements of advocacy strategy, and then he will interview Marco to really ground our discussion in country-level context and country-level realities. Let me also just briefly say that I have a few other colleagues online and with me today. Next to me is Nina Brandt from the Capacity Development Office of UNDG, and she was a member of the Communications and Advocacy Working Group, which, under the auspices of which these two pieces of guidance were developed. And also online is Gina Lucarelli, team leader for knowledge and innovation here at DOCO. And of course, I want to also mention that we have you online, 37 colleagues from around the globe. Really happy to have all of you on board. Really happy to have an enriching discussion with you today. And really, please, during any point in this discussion, feel free to use the questions box to put your questions, and make sure to identify your country and your agency or office. This webinar is being recorded and will be available later on YouTube if you'd like to listen, and will be shared and distributed. So we have a few polls which I will run during the course of the webinar, just to touch base with how you know, to get a sense from you of how your efforts to move forward with joint advocacy for the SDGs are doing at the country level. So without further ado, let me hand the mic over to Jim, who will take us through his introduction to the guide and to joint advocacy strategy for the SDGs. Jim, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Peter. The next slide, then.
Okay.
I can see them now. All right.
Oh, wonderful.
Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. It's really an honor to be here with you. You know, we live in a moment in which there's so much craziness around us. It's important to remember that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, represent something really noble. I mean, we get mired down in the technical aspects of them, but let's never forget that this represents an expression of humanity across the world to say these are the positive things that we intend to do, and we're committed to a process to do them. And to support that, we want to look at the role of advocacy, and in particular the role of strategic advocacy. As Peter mentioned, I've spent the last decade working with probably 1,000 UN staff all over the world, on every continent. And I've listened to what it means for UN staff to work on advocacy, to work on advocacy within the context of the UN system, very different political and country contexts. And while everybody's task is very different and very context sensitive, there are some things that are universal, and that's really what I want to focus on today. The next slide, Peter. I want to talk about this distinction between strategy versus tactics. It's a place where people sometimes can get confused, and sometimes offices are extremely good on the tactical side and not as equipped or thoughtful on the strategy side. Next slide. In this regard, this is my mantra from Sun Tzu in The Art of War. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And what I want to focus on this afternoon, is what it takes to make sure that you aren't, in your efforts on the SDGs, simply the noise before defeat. Next slide, Peter. Here's a little visual representation about the difference between strategy and tactics. These are two maps. One is a map of the world, and Marco will certainly recognize the other map. This is Maputo. So if I'm in Maputo and I'm trying to give a foreigner directions on how to get to the train station, the right map is the right map because it tells me what streets to walk on or to take a taxi down or a tuk-tuk. But if I'm trying to figure out how to get from Maputo to New York, it's really not a very helpful map. I need the world map on the left. It's important to operate in both of these things. Strategy is the big picture vision of where you are, where you're trying to go, and a plausible path of action to get there. Tactics are the specific steps involved in moving from one to the other. And we tend to fall, all of us, into the trap of operating at a tactical level instead of a strategic level. We know, oh, we'll put out a report, or we'll have this meeting, or we'll hold a news conference. And we do those things because it's what we're familiar with, not necessarily because they fit into some larger vision or strategy of, again, where we are, where we're trying to go, and a plausible path of action to get from one to the other. Next slide. No, Peter, that's the wrong order. Can you go? I think you may have skipped forward a whole bunch. Keep going. Back, 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 back. There. Okay, the next one.
Sorry.
Okay, there you go. Okay. Over the course of talking with people and teaching people how to do advocacy strategy over the last really 40 years, I finally figured out that it all boils down to three basic fundamental questions. And I'm presenting these in a way that's very simple, but you can drill down to a great level of complexity on each one. But it always comes down to three things. What do you want? Who are the key audiences? And what do you need from each of them? And what's your plan of action to win? So just think about these questions in reference to your own work. What do you want? Who are your key audiences, and what do you need from each to win? And what is your plan of action to win? And this is the exact same strategy model you learned as children in the manipulation of your parents and the other adults around you. Think about the children in your life. They know what they want. They know who their audiences are, whether it's mom or dad or uncle or aunt or grandma, and they have a plan of action. And it's that same basic intuition of how you advocate that we want to apply to the SDGs. Next slide, Peter. All right. What do you want? When it comes to advocacy in the UN system and the SDGs in particular, it's really about the dance between the long term and the short term. The 15-year vision of the SDGs is clear. Like, you know what your goals are. You know, your goals are equal education for girls. Your goals are what the SDGs have to say about climate change and life under the sea and all of these other kinds of things. That's what they are. They are Sustainable Development Goals. But the question then is, all right, that's fine, but what are your objectives in a 1 year or a 2 year time frame that build toward those goals in the specific context of your country and your UN team? So again, it's the dance between these long-term goals, which are quite clear. They're the G's in the SDGs, and the shorter-term objectives that build toward them. Next slide, Peter. Here are some of the kinds of objectives that in my work with UN offices around the world on the SDGs and my conversations with them that we hear as pretty common. That the UN team speaks with one clear and compelling voice, because the SDGs are a joint UN effort. They're not a UNICEF effort. They're not a UNDP effort. They're not a UN Women effort. They are a joint effort. So one objective might be to speak with a common voice, to secure a set of baseline measurements to track forward progress. This is key in a lot of countries, is to know where you've gone, you need to know your starting point, and you need to get the government to agree to what those starting points are. To secure some working alliances with key officials in the government, whether it's at the ministry level or the legislative level or the presidential level or the finance ministry, that depends on the country. But to have some buy-in in a very specific way from governments. Fourth, to draw some attention from the media. You know, one of the things I heard in several countries is, well, we did a lot of sort of public things when we did the consultations before the SDGs were enacted, but we really haven't gone back to the public. And one of the commitments of the UN system is that the SDGs and the advocacy on their behalf should be publicly driven. It shouldn't just be a UN project. There has to be public buy-in. So getting some attention from the media, or establishing a set of core relationships with civil society allies. Again, these are 5 examples of short-term objectives that build toward the long-term goals of SDG implementation. What those look like depends on your country context and on your UN team, but it's really important that every UN team be able to say, this is where we want to be 12 months from now. This is where we want to be 24 months from now. Next slide, Peter. All right, let's turn to question number 2. Who are your key audiences and what do you need from each? When you think about advocacy audiences, it's really important, I think, to look at 2 categories. You know, the obvious question is, who has power? Well, there's 2 kinds of power. One is who has authority, who literally has their finger on the light switch, who can say yes or no to funding at a national level, for example, for SDG implementation, or a policy change that promotes education for girls. Who has that actual authority in the governmental system to say yes and no? And then who are the other actors around them that wield influence? They may be other actors in the government. It might be the legislative branch. They might be civil society actors. They might be the public. But mapping out the audiences of authority and influence is really essential to forming a strategy. Next slide, Peter. This is an actual example of a map, and as Marco knows, we've used this as a model in the work that we did together in Mozambique, and I've used this in other countries. This is a very simple grid. Some of you have probably seen this before. At the top is the powerful. At the bottom is the weak. To the left are the people who oppose what you want. To the right are the people who are supportive. And if the first thing you have to do is map, okay, where is everybody now? Where's the finance minister now? Where's the president now? Where's the Chamber of Commerce now? And then you have to look at this map and say, all right, among the people who were powerful, like that little orange character at the top up there, how are we going to move that person to the right on the chart? How are we going to make them powerful but supportive instead of powerful and potentially opposed? And the other thing you need to do is look at who is on your side, who's supportive, but is politically weak, and what can you do to strengthen them? Maybe you have parent groups or women's organizations that are very supportive of what you're trying to do. How can you help empower them so that they become more powerful actors? So putting this map together and developing a strategy of the actors you need to most move and how to do that is really fundamental. Next slide, Peter. All right, and the third question is, what is your plan of action to win? In my experience working with UN offices, there are three essential elements to this plan of action. The first is messaging. Advocacy is communication. Advocacy is messaging. And it's extremely important that UN teams really have very clear, coherent, and consistent messages about the SDGs. And those messages need to speak to the large aspirational level of what the SDGs are and why they're important. Then they need to get down into the more specific level of each SDG. And then they need to get down into the more detailed level of what it is that the UN team is asking the government and other actors to do. And it takes time to develop a good message. And it's not actually a natural thing. In my work with teams, what we literally do is we have people work on their messages and we videotape them delivering those messages in role plays, and we show those on the screen, and we have people comment. And really setting aside time and process to develop your SDG messages is really essential. What are the activities that you're going to do? What kind of research, what kind of reports, what kinds of meetings, what kinds of conferences, what kinds of public outreach, really developing a list of activities that make strategic sense. And then measuring your progress. And monitoring and evaluating advocacy is tricky. I can't go into, obviously, a lot of detail in this presentation. We've written quite a bit about it, and there is some work on that in the guide that I put together for the UN on this. I hope you'll look at it. But, you know, if I'm measuring progress forward on a child vaccination program, it's a math equation. I can say, we expect that if we buy this many vaccinations and field this many doctors and do this many public service announcements, encouraging parents to participate and take their kids, we think we'll get this many children vaccinated. It's not as clean when you're measuring advocacy because there are other actors involved, so it's hard to pin down what the UN can take credit for and what it can't. And progress isn't always linear. Sometimes you work and work and work and nothing seems to be moving forward, and then you get a victory. But it is important to measure your progress, not just because you can fill out monitoring and evaluation forms for the UN system, but to make sure that the strategy you're using is working. Next slide. And then there's these internal questions, and here are three that I think are very useful to look at as you work jointly. First of all, what will your collaboration look like? Exactly what does it mean for UNICEF and UN Women to work together on X issue? What does that collaboration look like? Are you working together on your media? Are you working together on your outreach? Are you going to the government together? So detailing what your collaboration looks like. Detailing what your coordination looks like. And I want to say Marco helped develop this list. I thought it was a really good framing. This came out of Marco's brain when we were working together in Mozambique, this collaboration, coordination, and capacity framework. What does coordination look like? Who is it that takes responsibility to glue this all together so it doesn't fall apart? Is that in the resident coordinator's office? Is one of the UN agencies taking leadership? It needs to be very clear. And then capacity. What capacity do you need to build? Do you need to build more capacity in terms of training your team? Do you need more capacity for research? Do you need more capacity for outreach? So you want to think about this in terms of really moving forward concretely. What does your collaboration look like, your coordination look like, and your capacity that you need to build? Next slide. Final point. You know, I am a big believer in strategy, as anybody who's ever worked with me knows. I think it is the difference between winning and losing, between wasting your time and not wasting your time. But a strategy is not set in stone. It's not the 11th commandment. A strategy is the best guess that you can come up with about what you think will move you forward. But you need to also be aware of and to look for the unexpected. You never know what opportunity is going to come up that you didn't anticipate. So a strategy has to be dynamic. It has to be alterable. And if you do that, then you have a strategy that's wise. I encourage you to look at the guide. It's got a lot of good wisdom and information in there. It's not just from me, but from, I did interviews with UN country teams all over the world to try to get their best wisdom. We wrote it in a very practical, hands-on way. It's got some specific exercises you can use in your teams. And I just want to say before we get to Marco, at some point, I think, Peter, you put my email information into a slide. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions, if there's any way that I can support your teams. The work that you're doing is extremely important, and it's always an honor to work with the UN system. And that's my presentation, Peter.
Thank you very much, Jim. This is really a very, very important discussion that we need to have, and I think that you emphasize the importance of strategy over mere tactics. You develop sort of the key elements of that strategic approach, and you also talked about the elements of the coordination aspect, working together, collaboration and coordination and building capacity to better work together at country level. So this has really been a very, very fascinating and I think important look. And you also pointed out that the guide, which you wrote under the auspices of the Communications and Advocacy Working Group, really benefited from a lot of feedback from the country level. 3 case studies went into that guide, from Colombia on the Breathe Peace Initiative, from Montenegro, looking at a tightly knit sort of coordination environment for joint advocacy, and also the Pacific, the Free and Equal campaign. So it really was an important way to connect global guidance and with concrete practice at country level. So this is now a segue into the next portion of our webinar, which will be a conversation with Marco, UNICEF representative from Mozambique, on sort of how a strategic approach can be effectively rolled out at country level. So Jim, Marco, I'd like to please hand the floor back to you.
All right. Marco, do you want to just say a few words of introduction of yourself as we get started?
Yes, thank you, and hi to everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you, connected, and then taking part in this webinar. My name is Marco Luigi Corsi Marco, and I've been working as a representative here in Mozambique slightly more than 2 years now. And before coming to Mozambique, I worked in different country offices and different continents. In one of those, I had the pleasure to meet with Jim, and this is where our partnership, let's say, and friendship started.
I just want to say here at the start, I've worked with a lot of UNICEF reps around the world, and I've worked with Marco in 2 posts because normally I live in Bolivia, and that's where Marco was formerly the rep. Marco was really one of the most talented reps and has a lot of wisdom to offer. And Marco is one of the first people who tried to look in a strategic way, very concretely in the ground in Mozambique, about how to jumpstart a really effective SDG implementation process. And I don't mean just for UNICEF, but I mean for the UN country team as a whole. And we spent actually 2 weeks together in Mozambique earlier this year with UNICEF and the UN country team developing their strategies, and then they've done a lot of follow-up work afterwards. And so, Marco, the first question I want to pose to you is this one. When you think back to the beginning of that process and your country team looked together at the task of doing strategic joint advocacy on behalf of the SDGs, what were the challenges that you saw in front of you? Both the challenges institutionally and internally within your UN team, and also externally in terms of dealing with the government and other actors. What did the road ahead look like when you started to look at it?
Well, I think the challenge that that we faced was like and became actually our opportunity, let's say, was definitely to get the SDGs out of isolation. That was really the challenge, in the sense that we realized, and actually when we were here as well, we realized that you know, headquarters had been working on SDGs for several years. But then the notion of SDGs was not, you know, at the same level, at the country level, let's say, the same that headquarters, colleagues, or you know, institutions, etc. had. So really, the challenge was like how getting SDGs out of isolation. And when I'm talking about out of isolations, means you know, getting them out of the sectors, the vertical silos, and making sure that the SDGs and SD agenda really becomes a people's agenda. So out of it, then we decided as UNCT, after you left, Jim, to basically focus on what we called our motto, getting SDGs out of isolation.
And what did you find, what were the natural reasons that it was isolated? What is it that makes them isolated that you think is common in the UN system?
It's because you know, we work very sectorally. We work very SDGs. They're still you know, although the SDG and SD agenda is really connected, it is really you know, interconnected, etc. We still think in a sectoral way. So the challenge is really how to make how to walk across those silos and to make sure that it's really, I mean, if I'm thinking about, you know, some of the agencies, including UNICEF, we focus on some SDGs because those SDGs are more relevant to children, or more relevant to other part of the population that we are serving. So the challenge is really to make sure that how do we make sure that that interconnectivity, which is embedded into the SDGs and into the SD agenda, really becomes a reality. And then, of course, that kind of vertical approach is even stronger in at country level, where you have sectoral ministries which don't really glue together. So that is you have a different level of sectoral or vertical approach related to SDGs.
In looking outward at the political environment, particularly at the government, what did you and your colleagues see as the big challenges there?
Well, I think again, to make I would say that the big challenge is getting the sectoral plans to address SDGs coming together under one umbrella, because you know, the context here in Mozambique is such that the financial economic situation is not I would say conducive to address SDGs, if we address SDGs in a very sectoral way. So what we decide is that, okay, if we were to get SDGs out of isolation, and we look at, you know, your three groups that you have been showing us in your PowerPoints, like the public, the government, and the civil societies. We realize that actually, if you talk to the public, there is a very little understanding, or still not a good understanding of the SDGs. The government still think very vertical. So we decide that actually the CSOs that are the ones that the civil society organizations, which have a broader and holistic view of what's happening, they are the ones that we are able to walk across the silos. And this is where then we went for. I mean, when we started building our alliance, we decided to go for building alliance with the civil society organizations, which will help us in getting the SDGs out of the isolation.
So let's talk a bit about the strategies and actions that you and your team have developed. First of all, in terms of, let's look internally first at your UN country team. What are the interventions that you've made to try to break down those silos within your team and develop a more joint approach?
I mean, the first step definitely was the step that we took together in bringing you here and helping us to with really strategic advocacy around workshop around SDGs, and making sure that we could have as a UN system the same understanding of the interconnectivity nature of the SDG. So that was really the first step. But then also the second step was like, okay, let's define, and it goes back a little bit to your to what you mentioned in terms of presentations. That okay, what do we want to do over the next 1 year, 18 months? Let's be very realistic and to understand what can be done given the context that we are working in. So this became basically also the other element of getting SDGs out of isolations. It means actually contextualize the SDGs in the local context, which was a context, is still a context where there is still tension, there is economic financial crisis, so getting that kind of clarity among the UNCT members was very instrumental. And then addressing the other issue of collaboration and coordination and capacity. Okay, if we were to go ahead with that, what are the key elements of coordination, collaboration, capacity that we need to stick to? And this is where the UN Communication Working Group was very, very crucial in leading, or at least in making sure that collaboration, and by collaboration we define altogether that collaboration has to be meaningful, has to lead to 1 + 1 = 3, as not is equal 2. So that was also a very important step to be taken. And then looking at the issue of capacity, recognizing and acknowledging that across the agency, not everybody has an even capacity to address or to participate or to carry forward the work that we had committed to.
I want to go back to this question of messaging, and I remember this from our work together and also from some of the work you've done since. There's a lot of good UN messaging out there at the sort of global aspirational level, and you've talked about the importance of contextualizing the SDGs. How important has developing joint messages and a joint communication strategy been to the work in Mozambique?
Was very important, and I actually what happened was that we wanted a message crafted and then responding to the local context. So the other step was to have a gathering, workshops run with where we invited key civil society organization to work together with us to develop the message for around the SDGs. But then it was very interesting because, and this is another step in getting SDGs out of isolation, because we ran those workshops here in Maputo national level. But actually came out from the same civil society organization is that, well, you know what, if we want to get the SDGs out of isolations, we need to bring them down to municipality, to district level, because this is where then real things happen. And this was another very, very enlightening moment, let's say, that we hadn't thought about at the beginning. And this is where then the subnational workshops at district and municipality level happen. And was another interesting approach because we were able even to contextualize more what the SDGs messaging, because in March, and this is where the civil society organization were very instrumental to us. In March of 2018, there will be direct election of municipalities at some national level. So this is where then the things started becoming very interesting and actually attracting a lot of attention from the local media, from the TVs. Some of us were actually also interviewed during the workshops, and again helped very much in contextualizing and taking that message of getting SDGs out of isolation down at subnational level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And let me, I think what you're saying is so important because I'm thinking about the other participants on the call. You know, Mozambique may have started this process of joint work earlier than some of the other country teams. And I think people are looking for what's the right starting point? What's the place where we can genuinely meet across agencies and move forward in a strategic way? And I think it's really interesting that this idea of messaging and contextualization, both at a national and subnational level, was such an effective starting point in Mozambique. And I think that's something that came out of your conversations with one another. Marco, the last question I have for you is, think about the participants and think about what you've learned, especially in the last 6 months, moving forward in a very concrete way on this in Mozambique. Are there any examples of what you've done or wisdom that you've learned that you think has some universal value to other people who are listening in on the call today?
Well, I think it's, for me, there are some defining moments during this process. Again, one thing that I wanted to say from the very beginning, we are still in the process. I mean, I think work in progress, we started 6 months ago. So I think there is still, as I said before, a work in progress. But you know, one defining moment was when, and I'm giving this example just to say that be ready to the unexpected. You can plan as much as you want, but then the defining moments come out of the blue. And one of those moments where you know, out of the 3 days, 4 days workshop that we had. Jim, we were sitting together here in my office, and then, you know, we start drawing on a piece of paper. Okay, this is the way we go. 1, 2, 3, and then okay, so this is how we want to go, and was really the beginning of a journey which is still happening now. So that is one first, is that being flexible as you embark on these kind of processes, be ready to be taken to the unknown, because as I said, the other one is that when the CSOs actually during the workshop were saying, well, I think, you know what, I think we need to take it down to the subnational level, because this is where things will happen over the next months with the municipalities. There is a great opportunity to get really the SDGs out of isolation. And then trust the catcher. You know, there is, at the end of the day, you were saying, well, it is wrong, it is right. Well, actually, you just go, right, and then learn. Of course, with a little bit of vision, because you know where you want to go, but be flexible enough so that you know, good suggestions or opportunities will be able to be grasped. And the third thing, I think is very, very important to be, when you choose your alliance with your partners, very, very strategic, because those are the ones that they know the context, they know how you should move, and if you are open enough to the suggestions, and again you are flexible enough, you can make a big difference, and opportunities will come as you go through. As for instance, for us, is the municipality election in March 2018, and you will be able to get a lot of attention around what you are doing.
That's great, Marco. Really, really helpful input. We're going to start taking some questions from the participants, but before we do, is there any other point you want to make that we haven't gotten to?
No, that's most of what I think I can share. And as I said, you know, it's a working process.
All right. Thank you, Marco. Really great. Really, really helpful. Peter, let me turn it back over to you so we can start to take questions from the participants on the call.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Marco, for this really rich discussion. And now I'm going to turn the floor to you, to the listeners online. And this is an opportunity for all of us to have a discussion based on your questions and your comments as well. Feel free to come in with comments on the guide, Fulfilling the Promise, or Jim's presentation. If there are any questions on his presentation, feel free to come in on that as well as on the discussion between Jim and Marco. So this is really really a fascinating exchange. And the first question I will field is from so again, just to say, put your questions in the question box if you have one, and I'll kick off with Philip Pemba from Malawi, and Philip asks, what have been, and I'll just sort of throw this out to all of us, and we can, I think it's most specifically a question for Marco, but we'll see. What have been your experiences in getting government ownership on SDGs, advocacy, and communications in other countries? Oh, I see, in other countries. The challenge we face is that it has mainly been the UN driving the advocacy and awareness raising, and less of government taking up SDGs, advocacy, and awareness raising as their own responsibility through their relevant structures and line ministries, like ministries of information and civic education, as well as streamline and coordinate SDGs advocacy across government systems, structures with less push from the UN. This is a really good question, and I think that you know, we have, maybe I'll open up the floor to see whether either Jim or Marco or Gina would like to come in on this. I mean, I think this is a critical issue because this is really, as Marco said, the people's goals. So, you know, it's important to, you know, have a strategy, an engagement strategy toward the government, as well as toward civil society groups, as well as toward, you know, building ownership across wide sectors of the country. And I think that maybe let me just start by sort of asking Marco whether you can maybe address this a little bit in your country context in Mozambique, specifically the challenge that Philip is facing is that it's really been the UN driving advocacy and awareness raising, and less of government taking up SDGs advocacy. How have you been able to address that in Mozambique?
Yeah, that's correct, and that's why what I was referring to with our motto, let's say, is that getting SDGs out of isolation. And by isolation, I mean also, you know, that might become just a UN kind of business, or when it sits within the government, assuming that the government is totally you know, attracted to the SDGs agenda, becomes, but what we want to do is go beyond that. We want to make sure that the SDGs are really people's agenda. And to do that, to make sure that you need to contextualize it. You know, I think in our cases, in our case, as I was mentioning, we were able, just by, you know, maybe we hadn't thought about deeply, but we were able to link it to the municipality elections, which will happen in the next 6-7 months, in March 2018. So really, to make sure that it becomes the really people agenda, and then also authorities start feeling the pressure, has to be contextualized. And each country has different contexts, but we should be able to read the context. And this is where then I was saying before, eventually your success will depend very much on the depth of your alliance that you have been able to build over the time.
Thank you.
Peter, the other thing I would add is, you need to look at your government situation, and of course the government's not a monolith. You can find allies somewhere. But, you're really asking the question strategically, are you dealing with a situation in which you have a government that's open and interested and you just have to converse with them and sell your position on the merits? Or is this a government that's not particularly interested in the goals of the embedded in the SDGs, and you're going to have to develop some sort of public pressure to get them interested? Those are, that's a strategic fork in the road. Are you dealing with pressure or persuasion? And it's different in each country context. Governments tend to want to do things that make them look good. So are there ways in which you can make getting on board the SDG train make the government feel like it's looking good? The other thing that I think is a key opportunity in a lot of countries, not every country, there are very formal, like 1 or 2 or 5-year planning processes. And so to the extent that you can harmonize those national plans with the SDGs, that's another opening.
Great, thank you. Thank you. That's, I think, these are good ways in which to build government ownership and also to link to the local context. As Marco said, you have to contextualize the SDGs. Let me just move on to another question. Let me.
Maybe Peter, just while you do that, I just wanted to call. I've been looking at the questions as well. So we have a similar question from Cynthia Pra from the UN Information Center in Ghana. If I'm correct.
Sorry.
Right? No problem. And it's back to this question of government ownership of the SDGs. So just wanted to call attention that this is a question obviously faced by many around the world. Again, Marco is much more on the ground than I am, but maybe if it's helpful, all world leaders came to New York in September 2015 and made a speech about adopting these goals. You may be able to find that speech, and if that person is still in government, remind them of that wonderful speech that they made on the occasion of the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. That might be one way of sort of calling attention to the good work and the leadership shown by all the governments of the world to adopt these goals. So bringing it back to this ownership question. The theory was, anyway, at headquarters, maybe it didn't work as well as we had hoped, but the theory was that because these goals were developed after a 2-year intergovernmental process that was also accompanied by a large crowdsourcing effort, which reached 10 million people, that the uptake would be quicker. It seems what we're learning is maybe that theory didn't pan out exactly as we had hoped, but maybe just to suggest that colleagues may want to dig back into either some of the results in your own country of the My World survey, which did reach 10 million people in many countries around the world, and remind governments of that strong public focus on these issues, which eventually became the Sustainable Development Goals, and also to call attention to governments' own, heads of states' own words about the importance of these goals when they were adopted.
Great, thank you. That's a very important reminder. Thank you, Gina, for that. And before I dip into our questions, I'm actually going to launch a poll just to get it to sort of connect the discussion that we're having with your country experience and see how this is to sort of measure your, to not measure, but to get a sense of your progress with joint work on the SDGs and SDG advocacy. So I'm going to launch that poll right now. And just take a moment to read the question. The question is, do you work jointly as a UN country team on advocacy for the SDGs? So it's just a very sort of baseline question. And you have an opportunity to weigh in with your experience on that. Let's see, we have a question from, let's see, from Irshad in Comoros. And the question is, hello, Marco, you explain more the importance and commitment of CSO. So you were talking about civil society organizations. I presume that's what Irshad was referring to. Do you in Mozambique implement SDGs advocacy together with government, together with civil society organizations, together with media, and with community leaders? Is private sector part of the campaign? And lastly, are you including communities? Are communities at the rural level also looking into the SDGs? So while we have that poll going, let me just maybe throw the floor back to put this question to Marco and maybe Jim and Gina. But first, maybe Marco.
Sorry, yeah, if I understand correctly, basically in terms of private sector, of course there is a limited private sector here, but at national level and in one of the provinces where there is an active private sectors, they were part of the process. But of course, I think there will be a need for differentiate when you start creating alliances, and I don't know how I would call it. Which are the real alliances that you want to build on, and which are the actors that you want to interact with. So I think you reach a point where you cannot really build alliances, strategic alliances with everybody. So you make sure that there are those, let's say, partners, civil society organization, women-based organization, which were part of also the subnational engagement and process. But you reach a point where you say, okay, which are the alliances that strategically I want to build and then continue, and which are the ones that I am going to interact with. So as you go through the process, at least what we have seen here, you need to start making a little bit the difference. Over to you, Peter.
Great, thank you. I don't know, Jim, do you want to weigh in on this at all, and specifically?
No, I think Marco's answer is excellent, and let's make room for some other questions.
Okay. Yeah, so we've launched a poll, and we're waiting. We have a few questions which we've answered. This is just a reminder to all of you who would like to weigh in with a question. Please put your question in the question box. Or else, and let me also offer you the opportunity to voice your question in. So I can unmute your mic, and if you just send me a message letting me know that you would like to do that, I am happy to also to voice you in, so we can have a question, sort of a more, having a more dynamic exchange with you in the field level. Before we move on, we have a question from Nina, who's sitting next to me in New York, Nina Brandt from DESA. Yes, Nina, please.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And thank you so much, Jim and Marco, for your interesting discussion. I'm going back to the presentation that Jim made, and where you emphasized the importance of a dynamic approach, where the tactics need to be changed based on maybe new actors coming in or new circumstances. And I was wondering, in the country context, and maybe Marco, you can respond to this, you know, also in the context of more rigid UN planning instruments, can you maybe share some tips and insights as to how to create that room for change and new tactics? How do you, you know, once you have a communications and advocacy strategy, how do you make sure you stay alert and open for, you know, changes in environment that might affect your strategy? Maybe you have some anecdotes to share. Thank you.
This is Jim. One thing I would say is, and this is different in different countries, but it's really important, especially in a country team where you have a lot of foreigners in the leadership, you really need to make sure you have a core group of people from the country who are on the team who really get the political context and who are really gathering the best political intelligence they can and making sure that the rest of the team understands those changes in context. You know, I think about the UNICEF team in Thailand that we worked with, and they managed, this wasn't an SDG case, but they managed to win a very powerful victory to set up a system of national child support grants at a time in which the country's political system was essentially melting down. Over the issue, among other things, of government funding and subsidy schemes that were that were a polarizing issue. The reason they were able to do that was because they had local people who were Thai who really understood the political context and made sure that that nuanced understanding of what was going on was fully built into the strategy. So I think that's fundamental, is every country team needs to really make sure it has, even if it's just 2 or 3 people who get the local politics, who follow it closely, and who can communicate to the rest of the team, look, here's an opportunity that's out there that you may not be seeing, but I see it. Or here's a threat that you may not be seeing, I see it. So having that, I think, is really important.
Great.
Great, thank you, Jim. I have someone's hand up, but before I get to that person, I just want to ask whether Marco wants to come in with any other additional point on that question.
No, I think it's just one compliment that we discussed with Jim when he was here, is that, okay, you know, always going back a check. So I think you are able to check your assumption, you go back, and then eventually, as you go through the process, you are flexible enough to adapt to the changes that the context, because we are working in a dynamic context and things can change also rapidly. So I think that kind of flexibility to go back to your assumption built into your strategy and then eventually to adapt. Over to you, Peter.
Great, thank you. So let me just move to Viera Dragovic O'Donnell has a hand up, and I'm interpreting this to mean she might want to come in with a question that she will voice in. So let me just unmute her microphone. Wait a minute. Let's see. Unmute. Viera, you had your hand up, and I'm offering the floor to you if you'd like to have an opportunity to ask a question. Okay, Viera, I'm just giving you a second. Maybe you're unmuting your computer. But if there is, let me just check to see whether, yeah, so Viera, are you there? Okay. Maybe we'll get back to you in a bit if you indeed would like to. Maybe you could send me a message just letting me know that you would like to ask a question to us. Here, there's a question from let's see. Okay, Irada Akhmedova, and let me just, for the sake of having a little you know, sort of bringing in a colleague from the field level. Let me just see whether I can, Irad, if I can just unmute your mic, then you might be able to just voice in your question. Irad, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, Peter, good morning. Thank you very much for this interesting and thought-provoking, in fact, discussion. To a certain extent, I entirely agree with the three essential sort of prerequisites for succeeding in joint advocating for SDGs. But in my view, budgeting is also very important. So from this perspective, I would be extremely grateful if you could somehow share the good practices in joint budgeting for UN collective efforts to ensure that the strategic approach to joint advocating for the SDGs will, to a certain extent, yield results. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that question, Irada. So the question is on joint budgeting for the SDGs. I'm just going to mute you. Yeah, let me just take this opportunity maybe to ask Marco, you know, what sort of experience do you have on joint budgeting for the SDGs in Mozambique?
Well, okay, so that was a collective decision taken by the UNCT. You know, we have the assessment of a resident coordinator system within which we have 5 pillars, and one of the pillars is the SDG. So we decided as a UN country team to hold each other accountable around the SDG advocacy strategy, messaging, etc., implementation. So we decided to dedicate a portion of the one fund that we have collectively for the development, implementation, and monitoring and follow-up of the SDG strategy. So it has to be really a collective decision where each head of agency will hold accountable, and then, you know, decision is taken to allocate funds.
Great, thank you. Let me just ask Irada. Irada, I just unmuted you. Do you have any follow-up questions on that, or does that make sense from where you sit?
Well, thank you very much, Marco, for somehow sharing the experience in Mozambique. Unfortunately, not all UNCTs are as enthusiastic as the UNCT in Mozambique, which has the legacy of delivering as one approach. But perhaps there are other countries which encountered with constraints, financial constraints at the country level, and what were in fact the creative solutions, given that you know, these financial constraints are becoming an increasing challenge that we have to address. Thank you.
Right, I think you know, we will discuss this a little bit more at length in our next segment webinar on the UNDAF companion piece on joint communications and advocacy. But I think that you know, one thing that comes through clearly in that piece of guidance is that you know, one opportunity is to, through results groups, the interagency groups that are moving forward a particular UNDAF outcome, to really, you know, that's an opportunity for communications colleagues to sit with program colleagues and to think strategically about, you know, in the UNDAF, you know, how can communications help to drive programmatic results? And when the discussion is on that issue, you know, utilizing the results groups as a way to employ funding for programmatic activities or under the UNDAF outcome area to pool resources and to use funding to move forward a particular UNDEF outcome, to find the entry points for communications and advocacy in that outcome area, and then it's seen as a it's an opportunity to utilize resources for programmatic objectives that also maximize the entry points for communications and advocacy. We will discuss that a little bit more in length in our next webinar on the UNDAF companion piece, but I just wanted to throw that out there now. One moment, I have a question, and I think in terms of timing, it's now 10:15 in New York, and I think we have enough questions to continue for another 10 or so minutes. So I just wanted to flag that. There's a question from Viera. I see. Okay, Viera, you have your question here in the chat box. Let's see. How crucial is it, and in what way, to involve the local EU delegation where they exist in the SDG process? Fundraising, joint advocacy, any experience on that? I think it's quite critical to involve the EU delegation, where they exist in the SDG process, and would anyone like to weigh in on this? Gina, do you have any thoughts on specifically when the EU delegation is involved, how to sort of bring them in most effectively?
Hi, Peter. Yes, I guess this depends on what the country context is. If it's an accession country, or if it's a country sort of outside of the broader Europe. This might be a specific question that we should follow up bilaterally on.
Yeah, I think so. Okay.
Gina, I would just make this comment. I think if you have a country where the politics of getting into the EU or relating well to the EU are hot politics, it's a device. I mean, this was a while ago, but back when I was doing work in Montenegro with UNDP, engaging the European Commission team in the country to be an ally in their advocacy was essential to getting the government to pay attention. So I think your point is well taken. It sort of depends. If EU partnership adds to your political muscle, then do it. Any international actors that are there that add to your political muscle, that's an ally you want to have.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Anyone else would like to add something on that point? Okay, I'm just looking at the questions. I think we are, if you have any, let me just close this poll. I realize I opened it some minutes ago, and let me just share the results of that poll. So if you have any questions which you would like to ask but haven't yet, please put them in the chat in the question box. And this poll is just meant to sort of get a sense of, test the waters with our, do you get a better understanding of how well you are working at the country level on advocacy, joint advocacy for the SDGs? And it looks like generally 40% of you do work on joint advocacy for the SDGs together. but it's also interesting to note that 25% of you say that it's not fully sustainable. So while 30% of you have indicated that that you're moving in this direction. Let me just put out another poll, and then I should be able to, one moment, let me just get to the question. Let's see, hide results. Yeah, right here. So this next polling question is, where have you seen results from your joint advocacy work? And select one of the following options. Now let me just take a look at the, oh yes, we have a question from, okay. In fact, I'm going to try to unmute your mic. Hovhannes, we have a question from Hovhannes Gazaryan. And Hovhannes, I'm going to try to unmute your mic so we can see whether you can just voice in your, oops, yes. Hovhannes, you are live and online, and please feel free to ask your question.
Peter, Hovan is saying in the chat box that he has no mic, so.
Okay, all right. Okay, sorry about that. Got it. Yes, so the question from Hovhannes is, since the SDGs are supposed to be country-led and country-owned, reaching out to the public is equally important. In this respect, popularization of the SDGs appears to me quite critical in terms of getting public approval on SDG-oriented government policies. What would be your advice on popularization of the SDGs? I think this is a really interesting question, and I think there are a lot of things that are being done throughout the world. For example, I think it was in Haiti, where they actually developed an SDGs game that they brought into schools, and used it as a way to familiarize youth with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Other country teams have embarked upon using television and developing programming around the Sustainable Development Goals. And let me just maybe throw this question to Marco and to, in the context of Mozambique, in terms of your engagement with the public. I know you mentioned that you were focusing also quite heavily on civil society organizations, but in terms of popularizing the SDGs, maybe you could just mention again a couple of key aspects of your strategy. Marco?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, if you recall, and if we go back to one of the slides that Jim showed, were three basic, let's call it target group, if we want to call it that way. One was the government, one was the public, and one was the CSOs. Now, the strategic decision that we took was like, okay, let's start working on messages so that we can reach out to the public in order to put pressure on the government. So the next step of our strategy is actually reaching out to the public with the messages that have been developed together with the civil society organization in a context that they know. So that will be the next step in terms of implementing the advocacy strategy.
Great. So it's sort of like in sort of concentric circles. First, I know you mentioned that reaching out to civil society organizations is a critical part of your strategy, and then beyond that, then to
public.
Jim, do you want to add anything on this note from your experience?
I think Marco has it. But again, it's the way you popularize anything is how do you relate it to what's going on in people's lives? And this is just a habit that the UN system needs to get into, because in the UN system we tend to have a lot of discussion that still puts it in the context of what it says in UN documents. And you have to think about, how do you explain it to your neighbor? How do you explain it to the person online at the bank? Or you just need to get into the discipline of, how do I talk about why it's important to educate girls, or why it's important that there are these global goals? How do I talk about that to regular people? Once you develop the language in your own mind of how you talk about it with regular people, then that becomes language you can begin to adapt into institutional language. Otherwise, we're really, I mean, it would be the equivalent of if I started speaking in Spanish on this call, a large percentage of the people wouldn't understand what I'm talking about. And it's the same thing with popularizing these goals. You have to speak in a language that people understand and relates to their lives.
Great, thank you. So that's really touches on the fundamental importance of messaging and coming up with messaging that connects with audiences, constituents, and really contextualized, localized to context. I'm just closing this poll. I know we have just a couple of minutes left, so I just closed a poll, which let's see whether I can find it now. It's sort of disappeared off of my screen, but maybe you can see it better than I can at this moment. Let me just, let's see, let me move my messaging around. Let's see. So basically it found that in terms of where have you seen results on your joint advocacy work, 55% noted that they saw results in terms of a change in government policy. So that's really great, and something really, I think, to follow up on. And it shows that that obviously engagement with the government and getting the government to fully get on board with the SDGs is important, and not only that, but the work is leading to a change in government policy. So I think that's already a very encouraging sign. I think we're at the tail end of our exchange. I'm just going to put one more poll, which you can just answer briefly, which just gives you a sense of whether this webinar experience has provided you with what you need to engage better together on advocacy. So please take a moment to answer that poll. And I think we are running toward the, I don't see any other questions in the question box. It's now 10:29, so we're actually right on schedule, as this was planned to be about a 90-minute webinar. So let me, before I close and sort of conclude and wrap up, is there anything that either Jim or Marco or Gina or Nina here in New York would like to add before I wrap up?
I just want to, this is Jim, I just want to repeat my offer. If there are people who have some specific questions or any other reason they want to be in touch, they should feel free to do that. And Peter, I think, shared my email earlier, and if you want to do that again, that's fine.
Great. Well, I think, this has really been a far-reaching discussion. We started out by talking about the critical elements of well, first we introduced the guidance that we have recently launched. We talked about the critical elements of joint advocacy strategy for the SDGs, and we had a really engaging and rich conversation with an experience from Mozambique. So I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Jim immensely for all of your insights and wisdom and structure and content which you brought to this webinar. I'd like to thank also Marco, because I think that really, the really critical element here is connecting global guidance with country level practice and field testing it. The guide that we came up with is not meant to be a final product, but really a work in progress, a living document that that will be enriched by the sorts of discussions that we have had today. This is just and I also like to thank Nina for joining us today from the working group, and as well as thank you, Gina, for coming in at some critical moments during the course of this webinar. And I'd like to thank all of you at country level and at regional level, headquarters level. We have a real mix of colleagues here today. And the idea I would just like to leave all of us with is that this is not the end, but just the beginning of a conversation. You've heard the first part of this webinar series. The second part, which I hope you all connect with, is on the UNDAF companion piece guidance on communications and advocacy. And those webinars will be happening again on October 12th and October 16th. And you can just refer to the original invite which you received to register for those webinars. One will be in Spanish. And finally, the conversation continues on the One UN Knowledge Exchange. The One UN Knowledge Exchange is a Yammer platform, interagency Yammer platform to have discussions just like this. Interagency discussions on issues that are important to UN country. So if you have any questions about how to log on to the One UN Knowledge Exchange, please feel free to message us, to message me, and I will show you how to do that. So this is, again, I'm Peter from UNDOCO, and I'm just really happy, very grateful that we could have this fascinating discussion here today. And I'd like to just now conclude the discussion and to sign off. So thank you very much. And I will, before closing, I will publish the results of our poll, which is already done, actually. I think maybe, yeah. So we have, a good number of us have responded positively. And for those of you who have questions that that haven't been answered or would like fuller explanations on, then please feel free to get in touch or to post your question on the One UN Knowledge Exchange. So thank you very much, Jim, Marco, Nina, Gina, and all of you online. Have a great day, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Take care, and signing out.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity, Peter, and bye to everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Marco, nice to be with you, and Peter as well.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Take care. Much appreciated.